To close us out, we're going to ask to come to the stage David Hansel, Herminia Palacio, our deputy mayor, and Jerry Milner from the federal government.
All right. Well, I think we could keep going all day, if not all week. There were so many things we just touched on those conversations, but of course we can't because we're all here thinking about the things that are happening back in our offices. But first of all, to start out the closing part of the convening this morning, ACS operates within a continuum of New York City Health and Human Services agencies, all of which are critical partners in addressing the challenges we've been talking about all morning. And all of us operate under the leadership of Deputy Mayor Herminia Palacio. And she constantly challenges us to think bigger, to think more ambitiously, and to really think about how we can enhance our collective ability as a set of agencies to improve well-being for children and families across New York City. So I'm delighted that she's joined us today. Dr. Palacio.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Commissioner Hansel, for the introduction. On behalf of Mayor de Blasio, I really want to thank everybody's participation in this conference today. This is really a conversation that everybody here knows we need to engage in with urgency. I want to take a moment before my remarks to thank Susan Halpern and the Cyrus Fund for making this day possible, Gail Nayawith for everything that she does and her contributions, clearly my friend and colleague, Commissioner David Hansel. You've seen the panelists here, Errol Lewis for his sustained interest in covering child welfare systems, and to everybody here who each and every day is engaged in this work in the field. So I just sat through, as you did, this panel, and I didn't have any advance notice of what my panelists were going to say. I heard through their panel well-being as distinct from safety. I heard issues of race. I heard issues of poverty. I heard issues of justice. I heard about the intergenerational impacts that all of these issues have. And I was struck, as I was thinking about my remarks, by the subtitle of this conference: Evidence Transforms the Struggle Against Child and Family Poverty. So while I didn't have the advanced knowledge of the comments that the panelists made, nevertheless, their individual and collective wisdom informs my remarks. We've been talking about the struggle against child and family poverty for as long as anyone here has been alive. But as we know full well, this conversation is as important, more important today than ever. Poverty has always had the potential to become a vicious cycle. Poverty has always been as complex as the society around it. But the evidence is clear. Today in these United States of America, you are less likely to find your way out of poverty than your parents were. And to quote the economist Raj Chetty, the fraction of children earning more than their parents fell from approximately 90% for children born in 1940 to around 50% for children entering the labor market today. The evidence. And he goes on to remark how this is related very clearly to the unequal distribution of economic growth over the past several decades. I am certain that most of you see this play out in the reality of your work every day. And yet, many of the overlapping programs and nonprofits and government agencies that have developed over time have not fully caught up to this changed paradigm that is unfolding before us. More and more, the challenges we try to help people with are not temporary states. They are perverse inheritance as a society that we are passing down from grandmother to grandson, from father to daughter. But the time has come for a different approach. So as I am privileged enough to sit here at the beginning of a second term, as deputy mayor charged with the health and well-being of New Yorkers, I am committed to working for and with the communities we serve to forge a new path. And I am very fortunate to have commissioners like Commissioner Hansel, the staff at ACS, and across our agencies to help me and walk together. We must, with communities, partner in the widest way possible to smash these cycles that are ensnaring communities, especially communities of color. These cycles of poor health, including adverse birth outcomes and decreased life expectancies. These cycles of adverse childhood trauma leading to chronic diseases. These cycles of limited opportunity, low incomes, and contact with law enforcement and the prison system. These cycles caused by structural racism and economic disenfranchisement. To address these truly wicked problems, we need to lead a bold effort to rethink and reconstruct what we are doing as a city. The work we do will always be about the people we are trying to help. But we must understand that we cannot help those we serve without confronting the evidence. In other words, some very harsh truths about the systemic and systematic barriers to breaking these cycles. We must confront the evidence about the neurobiology and the neurophysiology of toxic stress. And we cannot transform the struggle, for a struggle it is, without 21st century efforts to dismantle decades worth of accumulated structural impediments in their way. And we have the opportunity and the responsibility to not just use the evidence, to not just be willing to apply the evidence. We have the unique opportunity and the solemn responsibility to build the evidence. We in New York can lead, not just in what we do, but the wins we can post to inform our work further and to inform the work of the nation. So I do really want to thank all of you for your enduring participation in this fight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce someone who knows that interventions need to take place at the earliest possible moment. Someone who understands the importance of preventing child trauma and brings his knowledge and perspective as a social worker to his current role as an administrator. Please welcome Acting Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, Jerry Milner.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. And let me say to everybody who's been on the panel here how much I appreciate your remarks. Some of you could just write my speaking points, and I wouldn't even need to be here. And some of you have emphasized the things that are critically important to me. I won't have time to elaborate and develop some of the points that I want to make, but I do want to put a few things out on the table for you to think about as we leave here today. First of all, I want to congratulate ACS and New York City for charting a course here in child welfare that we don't see in other places in the country. Your record here of such dramatic reductions in the foster care population is not typical. And as others have noted, there are strong pockets of excellence out there, many of which I'm trying to get around to see myself so that I can understand and educate myself better on what's working and why it's working. Unfortunately, they are still, in my view, the exception. And when I look at child welfare from a national perspective, as Andrew noted earlier, we see increases in children coming into foster care. From the federal perspective, That doesn't surprise me at all because that's what we fund. We fund the outcomes that we're getting right now from the federal government. Increased numbers of kids in foster care, increased numbers of children who are maltreated every year, and increased numbers of parents who have their own traumatic histories that have not been resolved, which in turn lead them to, in many situations, inflict that trauma on their own children. We don't fund the kinds of primary prevention efforts that I believe are fundamentally needed if we're going to get dramatically different outcomes for children and families. We still see primary prevention as something nationwide that somebody else does, not what child welfare does. And I think we have a real opportunity now to look at that in a different light. New York City has a special place for me in terms of just my thinking about child welfare and how we serve children and families. I spent 25 years of my life working in the Alabama child welfare system, just in case you're thrown off base by this New York accent that I have here. While it was still a part of that system, I had an opportunity to come up here 20-something years ago and visit the Center for Family Life in Sunset Park, which I'll be going back again this afternoon to visit again. And it gave me a view of how we can serve children and families that was very different from anything I had experienced up until that point. Two things. One, just the very clear understanding that when kids have to enter foster care, they don't have to leave their families. They didn't have to leave everything that was important, and it didn't have to be the traumatic experience that most of the kids in my caseloads experienced when they had to enter. So I got that. The second thing that Sisters Mary Paul and Geraldine imparted on me very clearly is that within the community, they were able to offer what all families needed, not just what the families who were child welfare involved needed. And in that way, they reduced the stigma associated with getting help when they needed help. And they also touched a broader community that allowed more families to avoid interaction with the child welfare system altogether. For all these years, those lessons have stuck with me. I may have to start paying royalties to the Center for Family Life because I invoke that example over and over again, and another one with a great deal more detail when I have more time. Let me just say quickly three things that again, I won't be able to elaborate on, but I want to be sure you understand where I'm coming from. When I view child welfare, and when I talk about changes to the child welfare system, I have no interest in tweaking the current system. I think despite the wonderful things that you guys are doing here, nationwide, we do not have a well-functioning child welfare system. We don't fund it to be well-functioning. We measure all the wrong things, and we reinforce many of the situations from which the children and families that we serve come from, often very negative, traumatized backgrounds and environments. Tweaking will not get it. We need to re-envision a child welfare system that adequately meets the needs of children and families before maltreatment ever occurs. So that's the one point I want to make. The second point is that primary prevention, in my view, is the answer. I'm not nearly as concerned about how to prevent the recurrence of maltreatment as I am about how to prevent the occurrence of maltreatment. When the report comes in to the hotline, the damage has been done. A child has been traumatized. Something has happened already, and child welfare focuses its efforts on what do we do after that. And I think we can focus our efforts on what do we do before that. I'm also not nearly as concerned about how we prevent the re-entry of kids in foster care as I am about how we prevent the entry of children in foster care to begin with. The same thing about trauma. We focus so much of our time and attention on how to deal with trauma after it's occurred, and we miss the point and the opportunity to prevent trauma from occurring in the beginning. And I think we have to focus on primary prevention if we want to make a difference in the lives of children and families. The third point that I want to make is that I think community is where that has to happen. Communities have to own the vision. Communities have to own the outcomes. And there are examples out there, you've got them here in New York City, where that kind of thing happens. I don't begin to underestimate the time that it takes, the investment, the commitment of work that it takes to get there. But I have a very simple view of the world. I grew up on a farm in nowhere, Alabama, and the world is pretty simple to me. There are fundamental values, fundamental principles that can guide our work with children and families. And I believe that as long as we're true to those fundamental values and we're strengthening families, giving them what they need in order to thrive. I so appreciate Jennifer's references to giving families what they need to thrive, not just to exist, not just to avoid having ACS come knocking on your door because a report of maltreatment has been made, but giving families what they need to thrive so that they can begin to break those very harmful cycles of trauma, of maltreatment, that will be repeated by the very children that we're serving right now if we don't begin to go, as Zainab and others have said, upstream before they fall off the waterfall. We absolutely have to direct our efforts. I think that requires a complete re-envisioning of what child welfare is in our country. Right now, again, Jennifer, you wrote my speech for me. We focus on safety, and that's what we get. And I'm not saying safety is unimportant. Nobody in this room would say that. What I do think is tragic is that we very often achieve physical safety of children at the expense of their emotional and their psychological well-being. And I don't think it should be or needs to be one or the other. We have to find a way within our system to balance those critical interventions that are required to save the lives of children and families with those interventions that prevent them from getting into those situations in the first place. Funding is an enormous impediment to do this, to do that kind of work from the federal government. In large measure, that's on me to try to advocate for and deal with. But I'll also say to you, funding isn't the only problem. It's the way we define ourselves as a system. And it is letting go of practices that are dysfunctional. We hold on to those same practices, those same viewpoints, because it's what we know. It's what we're comfortable with. And it's very hard. You know, the whole science of adaptive leadership tells us that people aren't nearly as afraid of taking on something new as they are afraid of letting go of something that they're comfortable with. And we have to let go of that. The word child welfare, if you look that up linguistically, it means child well-being. But that's not what we practice in this country. I applaud you and envy you for having so many articulate voices that bring that message to the table and to the communities that you serve. It is not typical in our country, but it is my message. And for my 15 minutes, not on this panel, to be in this leadership role that I am honored to be in. It'll be a consistent message for me, and I appreciate so much you letting me have a few minutes of your time for me to share that with you. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, Commissioner Milner and Deputy Mayor Palacio, for those very powerful words. I want to close by, first of all, thanking again the Cyrus Fund, Susan Halpern, the New School, Errol Lewis for moderating, all of our panelists, and all of you for being here. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking morning. There's so many things I'd like to talk about, but I'm going to close with just one thought. You know, a series of questions that came up over the course of the morning that I think are closely related include these. How do we engage those people who need to be part of this conversation but aren't here? How do we change the public understanding of what child welfare is and should be, and what a child welfare agency like ACS actually does? How do we partner with other service systems that are critical to addressing the issues like poverty, racism, incarceration that underlie the challenges that we as a child welfare system have to address? And I think actually, while the answers to those questions aren't simple ones, I feel very much in my role that they start with us at ACS. Too often, we have chosen to hide our light under a barrel. And we do that often because we fear, and not without justification, that any public attention we get is inevitably going to turn into public criticism. But we can't give in to that temptation. It is too important that we have this kind of dialogue. We have to talk about our ambitions, our successes, and our challenges. We have to go where the data lead us. And sometimes that's to success, and sometimes that's to failure and learning and trying again and trying something new and different. But we have to do that, and we, I believe, as a child welfare agency, have to demonstrate that we have a broad enough mission and vision about our work, about child well-being, thank you, Jennifer, to be a good partner to those public and private agencies that also care about the issues that we do. I hope that this convening this morning embodies the fact that ACS intends to be that partner. We look forward to more of these conversations, and I thank you all very much for being here.